So, I got a lot of critical feedback on my recent video on the death penalty and the strange paradox of innocence. If you haven't already seen it, please do go check it out before continuing here. I want to sincerely thank everyone who challenged my argument. I am very grateful to have that kind of feedback. Hopefully it will keep me honest and allow me to see the merits and the drawbacks of the argument accordingly. It's also good to have confirmation that my subscribers aren't just a bunch of ditto heads nodding along with everything that I say. At the same time, I hope that you guys can appreciate it when I challenge your preconceived notions about a topic, like the death penalty. I don't mean to sound petty here, but I couldn't help but notice that this is actually my most thumbed down video that I've ever made. I certainly don't insist that everyone agree with me. Quite the opposite. In fact, I would hate that. But I hope that merely disagreeing with me isn't the only reason why someone would vote down my video. Agree with me or not, I hope you find value in my presenting a creative, original argument on a topic that has been so chewed over like the death penalty. At any rate, I want to take this opportunity to address some of the challenges to my argument that showed up in the comments. There were a lot of criticisms, like I said, and I don't have time to address them all, so I'm going to target the ones that were either the most common or, in my opinion, the most compelling. But before I turn to that, let me quickly reiterate and underline what I said at the end of my last video. All things considered, I am against the death penalty. I gave 3 reasons for that. It's racist, it's too expensive, and it's cruel. I didn't elaborate on these points because, well, frankly, elaborations have been made many times before me by thinkers much more eloquent than I. But in case you're interested, I'll include references down below to some of the representative arguments just for the record. My point in making that video wasn't to say that we should, all things considered, keep the death penalty. It was rather to simply point out that giving up on the death penalty will come at a cost. If my argument is correct, that cost will be incarcerating more innocent people for the rest of their lives than we currently are today. I actually do think this is a cost worth paying, at least if the numbers that I had in my previous video are at least roughly correct. As such, I would be very happy to learn that my argument is incorrect. It would make it much easier to just abolish this antediluvian institution once and for all. Suffice to say, however, I have not been persuaded by any of the counter-arguments that were offered by my respondents, despite the general high quality of the objections. So let's turn to those objections now. First off, several people argued that my argument was founded on too narrow a basis because I only looked at the United States and not at other comparable countries. The US is the only modern Western state that still has the death penalty, of course, but couldn't a comparison of the exoneration rates between, say, Canada and the United States either support or undermine my argument? In short, no. As anyone who works in social science will tell you, there are simply too many cultural factors to control for internationally in order to draw any sort of reasonable conclusions on the basis of such data alone. Let's say, for example, that the exoneration rate in Canada is in fact lower than the United States. What would that prove? Would that support my hypothesis? Not at all. How could we know that Canada didn't have a lower exoneration rate simply because they convict fewer innocent people in the first place? Their criminal justice system over there is quite different than our criminal justice system here. There's a lot of different variables that you can't control for. Now, this isn't to say that looking at international data is worthless. It's just to say that it's far too complicated to draw any clear-cut conclusions, and I don't have the time in a YouTube video to even try and control for all the relevant factors. So I feel quite confident in limiting my study to the United States. Next up, several people argue that in spite of the statistics I presented, as long as the person is alive, there is always hope that they could be exonerated. If we execute that person, we end all hope, so we should never execute anyone. I must say, I found this objection to be the least compelling of the lot. It seems to involve a fetishizing of the idea of hope without actually looking at the facts about exoneration. It is, of course, true that once we execute a person, we can never go back. But once a person dies in prison through some other cause, we can never go back again either. The whole point of my statistical argument was that an innocent person is much more likely to die in prison if they are sentenced to life rather than if they're sentenced to death. If there's a problem with my calculations, then by all means bring them to my attention. But don't simply stick your head in the sand and say the actual facts don't matter. All that matters is this abstract notion of hope. The next objection was that I did in fact make a mistake in my calculations. I had said between the years of 1889 and 2001, there were 74 death row exonerations out of a total death row population of 3,577. This amounts to an exoneration rate of 2.07%. By contrast, there were 265 non-death row exonerations out of a total prison population of 1,404,032 inmates, or a mere 0.0188%. This suggests that wrongfully convicted people on death row are more than 100 times more likely to be exonerated than their non-death row equivalents. Several people pointed out that this comparison between exonerations from the total population and exonerations on death row was an unfair comparison. If someone is in prison for only 5 years, say, then their odds of exoneration will be much lower simply in virtue of the fact that they're not going to be around long enough. So rather than comparing Gen Pop exonerations with death row exonerations, I need to compare life sentence exonerations with death row exonerations. This criticism is absolutely correct, and I am very grateful to those of you who caught it. I'm frankly more than a bit embarrassed that I didn't notice this on my own. So I went back and I made the relevant corrections to my calculations, and here's what they should look like. The total population of prisoners serving life sentences is 140,610, or about 10% of the total prison population. That will cut the effect by about an order of magnitude. The actual exoneration rate amongst people sentenced to life is about 0.188%, 10 times greater than the 0.0188% that I gave in my initial video. This is substantially smaller than I initially claimed. Nonetheless, I do think my basic point still holds. While the exoneration rate for lifers is much higher than I initially said, it's still much lower than the rate on death row. Recall that the exoneration rate for death row is about 2%, which is still more than 10 times the 0.188% for lifers. The difference is much smaller than I initially estimated in my first video, to be sure, but it's still a tenfold increase in your chances of exoneration if you're on death row than if you're off of it. And I think that's pretty significant. Okay, moving on to the next objection I received. Recall that I took a page from Ernest van den Haag and argued that several other activities cost far more innocent lives than the death penalty, yet hardly anyone seems up in arms about that. I gave the example of about 36,000 people dying in car accidents, most of which occur at speeds in excess of 40 miles per hour. Now, some people actually challenge those statistics, but that rather misses the crucial point of the objection, so I'm not going to bother vetting that. I wondered aloud why, if saving innocent lives is such a priority, is there not more attention paid to these other activities which end the lives of far more innocent people? Now, several people responded to this argument, saying that there is an important difference in kind between these two types of deaths. There were at least two main versions of this difference in kind that were argued for. The first version claimed that people who drive accept the risks when they get in a car, and if they truly wanted to, they could opt out by not driving in a car, or at least not driving on roads with speed limits over 40 miles per hour. There is no analogous way to opt out of the death penalty, short possibly of moving to a state or to a country that doesn't have the death penalty, but that's a rather onerous burden. Whether or not it's more onerous than not driving a car or not driving on roads with speed limits greater than 40 miles an hour, that's not a point I'm going to consider here. I'll just grant it for the sake of argument. This argument was made by, among others, my friend Honest Discussioner in a response video he made to mine, and just in case you haven't checked out his channel, do please head over there and tell him that I sent you. I think you'll find it worth your time. The problem I have with this version of the objection is that many kinds of activities to which I refer to kill people who don't opt in any sense at all. Car accidents, for example, will often kill pedestrians or cyclists. Surely no one would argue that these people accept the risks simply in virtue of stepping outside of their homes. And incidentally, I can't help but notice the striking similarity between this argument and the pro-life argument that says that women accept the risks of getting pregnant when they choose to have sex, therefore they're obliged to keep the child. I don't buy that pro-life argument myself, and I somehow doubt that many of the people who made that argument against the death penalty would buy it either, but I'll set that aside for now. The second version of the difference in kind argument holds that there is something inherently different between accidentally killing an innocent human being and deliberately killing an innocent human being, even if that deliberate killing is done unknowingly. This was probably the single most common response to my video, and I have to say that while I certainly appreciate the argument, I was disappointed in how many people thought that simply pointing this out alone was sufficient to undermine my whole argument. I do think the basic premise here is correct. There is a morally significant difference between accidental killings and deliberate killings. I'm not a utilitarian. I don't think we should simply try to maximize innocent lives saved. Other factors, such as intentions, also matter. But at the same time, I'm also not a deontologist, and frankly, I doubt that most of the people who made this argument are either. The idea that intentionally killing an innocent person is so horrible as to completely outweigh any number of accidental innocent deaths is a premise that I find to frankly be morally ludicrous. While the numbers aren't the only consideration that matters, they're certainly an important consideration, and when the numbers stack up the way they did in my particular comparison, that's 36,000 a year due to car accidents versus about 1.4 a year due to the death penalty, I think that it really becomes no contest. As a quick aside, I realize that in real life we don't have to choose between these two things. We can advocate both for the abolition of the death penalty and for safer auto and traffic law regulations. I draw the contrast as a way of trying to uncover what our genuine priorities are. Those who advance this argument claim their priority is saving innocent lives, but I don't think that's sincere. I think their real priority is simply ending the death penalty, and pointing out that it occasionally kills innocent people is just a means to that end. Now that's fine, I've got no problem with that strategy, but let's at least be honest about the precise role that the innocent lives are playing in this discussion. Anyway, back to my rebuttal. Think about it this way. If you had a magic wand that could either end all accidental deaths from car accidents, saving about 36,000 lives a year, or it could end all executions of innocent people, saving about 1.4 innocent people a year, which would you choose? Please, be honest. I highly doubt that any person put in that situation would actually choose to save the 1.4 over the 36,000. And for those that would choose to save the 1.4, I'm curious if you've thought through the implications of your position. Think about what that would imply for issues like, say, euthanasia, for example. Now, demographically speaking, people who are opposed to the death penalty tend to favor a right to euthanasia, but that's suddenly a very uncomfortable pairing. If we allow euthanasia, then we are guaranteed sooner or later to end the life of an innocent person who actually could have recovered, but because of either a misdiagnosis or a misprognosis, they chose physician-assisted suicide instead. If we cannot accept a policy that allows for the intentional killing of even one innocent person, regardless of the costs in pain and suffering to others, then I think you've just committed yourself to being opposed to euthanasia in all circumstances. Now, maybe you're actually okay with that. I don't know. My point is simply that when you say the numbers don't matter, period, you've chosen a pretty radical position with far-reaching implications, and I honestly wonder if you've given a thought to precisely what those implications are. All right, now on to the final objection I'm going to consider. Several people accuse me of engaging in a kind of broken window fallacy argument. In case you're not familiar with it, the broken window fallacy is an economic fallacy that makes the mistake of thinking that certain behaviors, such as, for example, breaking a window, can actually be good for the economy since it stimulates production and trade. The Glazier Act gets paid for producing and installing a new window. The fallacy occurs because this line of thinking fails to take into account what would have otherwise been done with those resources had the window not been broken in the first place. The owner of the window could have bought something else, like, say, a new computer, perhaps, and then he would have had both a window and a computer. The glazier, at the same time, could have spent his time either doing other work or simply taking time off. And thus, the total utility in the world would be much higher if the window weren't broken in the first place. Now, I hope you can see how it is that the charge of this fallacy is going to be leveled at the argument that I made. I suggested that right now, death row cases get a disproportionate amount of social and legal resources, which in turn lead to much higher exoneration rates. But mightn't it be the case that if we were to abolish the death penalty, those resources would stay in the criminal justice system and simply be redirected towards other cases? If this were the case, then the overall exoneration rate would stay effectively the same. They would just be distributed more evenly across the remaining non-capital cases. We could have our cake and eat it too, as it were. Now, certainly if this is the case, then my principal argument collapses. And in fact, investigating whether or not this would happen has actually been a large part of my research over the last few months as I've been working on this project. Suffice to say, I think we have reasons to be skeptical that the resources would just redistribute themselves. There are both psychological and empirical reasons for this skepticism. The psychological reasons are, ironically, best captured by the very arguments death penalty advocates have been pushing for years. Consider, for example, the title of a book by Hugo Adam Badu, one of the greatest death penalty abolitionists of the 20th century. Death is different. Or, as YouTube user The Messianic Mechanic put the point in a comment on my last video, the fact that innocent people may be locked up for life in my name weighs on my conscience far less than the fact that someone might be executed in my name, even if eliminating execution means more innocents spend more time in jail. I think he speaks for a lot of people when he says that. Now, whether or not he's justified in thinking that way is one thing, but I hope it's clear that if in fact many people do think along those same lines, then the gravity of the death penalty is precisely what attracts all that surplus oversight. Removing that gravity will mean the extra attention will simply go away. As for the empirical reasons, I'm sad to say I can't really go into detail here as my research is actually still ongoing. I have actual data, which is a thrill for a trained philosopher, let me tell you. Thanks in large part to the assistance from the Experimental Philosophy Workshop at Yale University who have helped me out with this. So far, it does in fact actually suggest that the surplus oversight would indeed diminish, if not disappear, but I don't actually want to share that data with you just yet because I'm not done gathering all the information that I'm hoping to get, and I don't want to release the data until I feel it's complete. Hopefully, once I do get the whole thing compiled, I will do a follow-up in which I break that down for you. But I will give you one important hint. Keep your eyes on 3 states: Illinois, New Mexico, and New Jersey, which in 2001, 2009, and 2007 respectively abolished the death penalty in their states. Looking back at previous states that have abolished the death penalty is actually not as helpful as you might imagine, in part because many states abolished the death penalty before there were clear records on exonerations kept, and in part because of confounding factors. The advent of DNA testing, for example, just happens to coincide with the same period of time in which Rhode Island and Massachusetts abolished their death penalty, making it really hard to draw any clear conclusions. Anyway, if my hypothesis is correct, we should expect to see lower exoneration rates in Illinois, New Mexico, and New Jersey over the next decade or so. This won't be dispositive, of course. If the exoneration rates drop, it doesn't necessarily prove I'm right, and if they don't drop, it doesn't necessarily prove I'm wrong. Other factors could very well be at play. But it will at least be suggestive, and we should pay close attention to those 3 states in the decades to come. All things considered, while I do appreciate the critical feedback, like I said, I am not terribly persuaded by them. It's not that they're not worth considering, they are, it's just that I don't feel that the fundamental argument that I made has successfully been undermined. Thank you all very much for watching.
And the mercy seat is smoking, and I think my head is melting, and in a way that's helping to be done with all this twisting of the truth. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and anyway I told the truth.